I told you last week that this book is a dark comedy that exposes the underbelly of injustice under corrupt leaders. Nowhere in the book of Esther is that darkness stronger than in this chapter and our passage for next week. I admit I was tempted to skate past these parts of the story, to give a quick summary so that we can jump to the places where it's easier to find God between the lines of this story. But if we were to do that, we would miss some of the stars in the night sky of this book. So let us continue in our quest to find God even in the darkness. We pick up after King Xerxes has deposed his queen Vashti. He has taken her crown and banished her from his presence because she disobeyed him publicly, refusing to participate in her own humiliation at his feast. Sometime after this 6-month celebration has ended, when King Xerxes' anger has abated, after he's slept off the hangover, he remembers what he did in his drunken state, and that he no longer has a wife or a queen. And again, the king is given some advice. This advice is even more horrific than that which he was given in the last chapter. But the king is pleased by the thought of following the advice given by his advisors and counselors here. So he continues to rule, guided by his whims and pleasures instead of wisdom and principle. And so the king sends out commissioners throughout his kingdom to find beautiful young virgins, kidnap them from their homes and their families, and bring them to the palace in Susa. And finally, we meet the heroes of this story, as we learn of one of many families injured by this heinous decree. They live in the capital city of Susa, a Jewish family, small and pieced together, but they still remember that they are Jewish, that they are of the tribe of Benjamin, even though the surviving members of this family have most likely never seen the city of Jerusalem. But still, they remember their ancestor Kish, the one who was kidnapped from his home in Judah under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Somehow, his children and grandchildren managed to carve out a life even in this exile. And even after Babylon fell and Persia came and took control, they have managed to survive. And so now we find the great-grandson of Kish, Mordecai, still searching for ways to survive brutal empires, and about to watch his little girl, Hadassah, the cousin who he adopted and raised, be carried away from their home, much as his great-grandfather Kish was, though at the behest of a different king leading a different empire. Mordecai isn't able to save Hadassah from being taken captive, but he looks for any way he can to mitigate the danger and degradation that she faces. Mordecai knows that Hadassah's nationality and heritage might put her in greater danger in the palace. And so he warns Hadassah to hide her identity, to keep even her name a secret because it is obviously Hebrew. And so, as many immigrants and captives have done throughout history, Hadassah uses a name that sounds Persian. Esther. It means star. Maybe as a private joke between Mordecai and Hadassah, it also sounds a lot like a certain Hebrew word that means hidden. and much as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the book of Daniel are better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we usually remember Hadassah under this assumed name, Esther. We even call the book after this Persian name that she takes. So Hadassah is torn from the life she knows, the family she loves, to live as Esther in the king's harem. The young girls and women who have been kidnapped spend 12 months in preparation for the king, waiting to see exactly what their fate will be. In this time, Esther wins the favor of Haggai, the eunuch in charge, and he does what he can to make her life comfortable. As comfortable as life in captivity can be, he gives her the best food, the best place to sleep, even servants to tend her. Everything he has to offer in his limited ability to make her life a little easier. And so for an entire year, Esther goes by a different name and keeps her identity a secret, just as Mordecai counseled her to do. We find in the text that there is a standard process for how it goes when the king is ready to vet one of these candidates for queen. It's not a good or wise one. It's not an interview. There's not a list of requirements for their different skills that might serve the kingdom. It's all about what pleases the king. And it's not a beauty contest, as sometimes Hollywood might portray. These captive women are taken into the king in the evening and leave his chamber in the morning, to then go move in with the king's concubines. The woman will never see the king again unless he summons her by name. But even if she is forgotten, that doesn't buy her a ticket home. She still lives out her days in the palace, whether chosen by the king or not. I can't help but wonder if these young women would rather be remembered and favored and thus receive the privileges of the king's favor, or if they'd prefer to be forgotten and left alone without the burden of pleasing the king further, but also without the protection and comfort that comes with being the king's favorite. Either way, they remain captive and at risk. We have seen that jewels and crowns don't protect them from the king's wrath if they fall out of favor with Xerxes. The crown certainly didn't keep Vashti safe. By the time it is Esther's turn to go to the king, it is the 7th year of the reign of Xerxes. Now that might seem like a trivial data point until we remember that he gave the banquet described in chapter 1 in the 3rd year of his reign. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly when he started this search for a new queen or how often he brings in these young women to his rooms. But in the 4 years between Vashti and Esther, how many women did he kidnap and abuse for his own amusement? We don't know. Doubtless many. This isn't a romantic story, I'm sorry to tell you. The man looking for a wife and a queen is not some charming prince who will make her dreams come true. He is a drunken and violent fool who sees women as objects for his pleasure and control. We see the king give in to his desires wantonly throughout this entire book. We saw it in chapter 1 in his excessive displays of wealth, with his excessive drinking. Now we see it in the way he indulges his lust and sexually exploits who knows how many women, because it pleases him to do so. It's a dark book, and this is one of the darkest chapters in it. But there are sympathetic characters, even heroes, in this story. Moments of light, stars, in the night sky, if you will. Even as we read of the sins of Xerxes, we read of Esther's wisdom in listening to Mordecai and Haggai. And we read of the steadfast love of a father, as later in the book, we see that Mordecai goes every day just outside the courtyard of the harem, getting as close as he can to his little girl, asking anyone passing by if they have news of her. We see love and faithfulness and kindness even amidst great wickedness here. The text does not tell us that Mordecai prayed to God as he sought news of Esther outside of the courtyard of the king's harem. As I told you last week, the text of Esther never directly mentions God or prayer, but it's hard to imagine a follower of God and a father not praying for his daughter in these moments. I can't quite picture what he might pray for, though. It's hard to say. There are so many things to desire for the little girl he loves. At least a year after Hadassah was kidnapped, she is called under the name Esther to take her turn to go to the king. It happens that this young Benjamite woman who hides her name wins the favor of King Xerxes. He is more attracted to her than any of the other women taken, and so he crowns Esther as his new queen. And of course he celebrates by throwing another banquet, his favorite thing to do. Our text never mentions any appeal to God on behalf of Esther. It never mentions divine intervention. But our author leaves breadcrumbs for us to help us see God at work in hidden ways between the lines of our text. I don't think the person writing this story wants us to view the way Esther easily wins the favor of every single person she meets instantly as an accident of fate. It is not sheer good luck that she finds herself in this position as the king's favorite, being brought into a position where she ultimately has a crown on her head and the ear of the king, if not a great deal of power to go with it. Someone unseen throughout the narrative is working to see the crown on Hadassah's head, though we don't yet know what for. That comes later. That someone is someone who knows her real name. God may be quiet in this story, but God is not absent or uninterested in the suffering of his people. The book of Esther is a rough read sometimes. It's not always easy to look into the darkness that this story presents long enough to see the light. Because as we look for light, we can't help but notice all the bad too. The text unveils the dangers of foolish leaders who are guided by their whims. It shows us the dangers of overconsumption, of unchecked wrath. It shows us a few different ways that people respond when backed into a corner by unjust leaders dead set on dehumanizing them. In chapter 1, we saw how Vashti fought against the wickedness leading the empire by refusing to participate at all in the system and her own degradation. It was an approach that brought great risk to herself and others. In the story, it doesn't seem to yield happy results, for her own life at least, but it does open a door that another may yet walk through. Esther and Mordecai have a very different approach to life in the Persian Empire under King Xerxes. Vashti saw a wicked game and refused to play it at all. Esther works within the system, seeking out advice from even some of her captors like Haggai, working to mitigate the harm caused to her at the command of Xerxes as much as she can. Two very different approaches from people living at the whim of a violent and impulsive man. People who have very little power to resist the workings of the empire, but find ways to nonetheless. We don't know how Vashti operated in the years leading up to her act of defiance in chapter 1. But by that point in her story, she has decided that the most important thing to her in interacting with this drunken king is to not participate in her own degradation, even though refusing to do as he says risks everything, even perhaps her own life. We know this king does not mind killing people. For Esther, living under a violent empire is about survival. I wonder if that's an outlook she gained from the generations of her family who have managed to survive multiple empires after kidnapping, against all odds. And so she hides her identity and even her name. Anyone who has hidden a piece of themselves to try to stay safe in a world that is unkind to them will understand all of the reasons Esther may choose to do this. There are reasons for people to use both of these methods to resist evil. One refuses to compromise one's own values and morals, avoiding participating in any semblance of evil. The other looks for ways to work more safely within the system, looking for safer options to mitigate harm, to minimize what evil might be done. Both can be faithful responses of people without power to the power of empire at work for evil in the world. Both bring potential risks and rewards, as we see in this book. Sometimes meaningful change requires people of both temperaments to see reform actually come. We don't get to see what comes of Esther's efforts yet in this story, but soon we will get to see how God can use her even in the palace of King Xerxes to do more than she ever would have imagined. For now, in the book of Esther, we see God working quietly behind the scenes, through Vashti, through Mordecai, through Esther, and even Haggai, to bring about a better future. It takes a great deal of discernment to choose between the paths available to us when the world seems steeped in darkness. But may we have the wisdom to know what God would have us do in response to every evil we encounter in this world. And may we have the courage to resist evil wherever we find it in our world.